hate New York City. It's loud, busy, and has a very distinct smell of cold, cigarette smoke, and garbage. If anyone's ever been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So when I visited this spring, you wouldn't expect me to expect anything less than a city full of trash and a ton of people. But every single time that I go there, I seem to think of myself remembering how New York City sometimes is pretty good, except for your wallet, because of course coffee's supposed to cost $10, because why not? But Central Park, interesting people, and the city that never sleeps. For 1 week, doesn't get old. But after that 1 week, you find yourself remembering that New York City pizza just isn't as good as Chicago style, and that the people are not as connected as they once appeared to be. And maybe that's because most people are tourists, like me, and like to take pictures of everything, or maybe that's because our society as a whole isn't as connected as we once thought it was. Think about your everyday life. How many times do you spend interacting with people? How many close friends would you say you actually have? How many community organizations are you actually a part of? Because our society has found it even more difficult to connect with people, whether it be a stranger in New York City, your closest childhood best friend, or even our own families, has found that connection has become more and more difficult. Even in everyday aspects of your life, we see that this connection is detrimental when we don't constantly seek it. That our communities have become more and more infrequent in our society. And that when we constantly dissolve communities and connections become harder to form, that we see the decreased emphasis on social interaction create detrimental impacts for our mental and physical health well-being, creating unprecedented levels of loneliness. The amount of people who are married in everyday life is 5% less than it was 8 years ago. And according to Pew Research Center, as much as 47% of Americans say that finding close friendships and romantic interests are more difficult than they were in the past 10 years, because our society as a whole is becoming more and more disconnected, and that is my concern. One of the first studies that examined social interaction was conducted by Norman Triplett in 1898. He analyzed the performance of bike racers and found that cyclists who trained alongside another person compared to when they simply tried to beat their personal best time performed better. Then he studied children who worked cooperatively and in competition with one another, and found that the children who worked cooperatively with another person performed better when they were trying to reel in fishing rods at a faster time. Now, these findings, in addition to other ones, created the concept of social facilitation and the classic study of social psychology that we know today. In this, he found that people who work alongside another person, whether it be cooperatively or performing to an audience, actually increases your own behavior, effort, and skills. Think about it in your everyday life. Everything that we know how to do, how to talk, walk, perform, or do anything comes from our ability to interact with our parents, siblings, friends, and even strangers in New York City. But without this necessary interaction, our fundamental cognitive development and biological need to seek one another doesn't actually exist in humans. But this constant desire to connect doesn't just exist in humans, but even comes from our biological nature. A 1937 study analyzed worker ants and found that worker ants who worked with other worker ants performed faster. Birds fly in flocks, and people seek partnerships and relationships, even if they may be questionable. Just ask my ex-boyfriend. So, where did this necessity of relationships take a turn? Where our own evolution and biology turns against us actually comes from our desire for efficiency and convenience in society over our own mere connections. Contrary to popular belief, we don't necessarily disapprove of connection. In fact, we are social beings who crave relationships, communities, friendships. But when we constantly crave connection to people around us, it becomes easy to fall into the trap of using your cell phone or other instances of quick, efficient communication in order to replace our biological necessity for relationships. So, in exchange for technology, we have this idea of connection, where our own psychology is used against us in order to form this idea that we are connecting with other people. But this idea of connection isn't real. When we're constantly on our phones, on social media, it can actually create negative instances for our fundamental well-being, for our mental and physical health. According to NPR News, over 3 in 5 Americans are lonely, with this number slowly on the rise every day. And that people who often subject themselves to social isolation create heightened risks for depression, anxiety, substance abuse, obesity, and in extreme cases, suicide. And even Josh Winstrom from Times Magazine has found that people without strong social bonds have been found to raise their risk for premature death by as much as 26%. When we constantly are surrounding ourselves with this quick fix of technology, it doesn't just manifest itself in our relationships when we choose to use technology over these fundamental connections. But even going to the grocery store, you no longer have to interact with the cashier by using self-checkout machines, and no longer have to go in person to a bank in order to deposit a check. It's just become more societally acceptable to exist by ourselves, especially if we're using technology. So, the true nature of our lack of connection isn't that we don't value connection. At the end of the day, we are social creatures, longing for community and connection. But the true nature is that these public sphere places are becoming less obvious, that when we're constantly using our phones, that the in-person connection places, like libraries, parks, trail spaces, and funding for all these in-person sites has decreased. That in the American political system, that in-person voter turnout, volunteers for civic organizations and public meetings have all decreased. And that is my fear, is that if we constantly are avoiding connection, avoiding community, and constantly valuing convenience over connection, that our ability to form relationships with people and benefit our political system, our democracy, and our cultural systems will completely fade away. And as somebody who's about to graduate, it's really scary to think that I might not have any social interactions at all in the future, especially because one of my biggest fears is being alone. But more than that, I fear for my community, for the isolation and polarization that will plague our society, that without these communal spaces where we can acknowledge people with differences from us, that without places to actually exist in and exist in public sphere places, that our society will become more isolated, and that New York City, distant, absent, and full of people without actually interacting, will become the new normalcy. But how do we fix this? How do we come to a solution when our own society and evolution is rooted against us? That the psychology behind technology primes us to seek social interactions for convenience and efficiency over anything else. Well, the first step is to form connections with people and to use your connections in order to form larger communities. Volunteer for those organizations in order to build communities up rather than tear them down. Because only when we can acknowledge the community and the people around us as people will we be able to come up with a solution to promote communities. Vote for your democracy and contribute to the politics and the cultural systems that have been denied from us. You don't use your technology in order to avoid social interactions, but use it in order to create meaningful relationships with people. Exist in spaces where you don't necessarily have to use your technology all the time, where you can simply be a person. And finally, practice patience. Because even though we long for efficiency, for these quick fix solutions for technology and interaction, we have the ability to relax and simply spend time with people on our own free will. And only then will we be able to come up with solutions, meaningful relationships and friendships and communities that come from the root of ourselves. Because even though social interactions may become less and less frequent, they are still all around us. So, even though my best friend is probably not in New York City, and I may not have the best interactions with people there, maybe next time I go, I'll be the person sitting on the subway who takes off their headphones and comes and sits next to you. Maybe next time I go to New York City, it won't be a cold, distant place full of people without interactions. And maybe I'll see it less as a city of bad pizza and garbage, and more as a city full of people with real stories, real connections, and real moments. And only then will we realize that New York City and our world is full of connection, opportunity, and communities that will make our world a little bit of a less fractured place. Thank you.